I watched him sit alone, mocked by everyone, and as a waitress, I was the only one who showed the disabled millionaire any kindness. From that moment on, our lives changed forever. He looked so small in that crowded cafe, a fragile figure in his wheelchair, his expensive suit contrasting oddly with the cold stares and cruel whispers weaving through the air like smoke. The laughter wasn't kind. Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, and for 37 years, I've been invisible. Not literally, of course. Customers see me when they need their coffee refilled or their plates cleared. But as a person, as a woman with dreams, fears, and a heart that breaks a little more each day, I might as well have been a ghost drifting between tables in Tony's Midtown Cafe. The morning it all began, September rain drummed against the windows like restless fingers. Manhattan streets gleamed black under the neon glow, and steam rose from manholes like spirits escaping the underworld. I arrived at work before dawn, as I had every day for over 3 decades. My uniform, a faded blue dress with white trim, hung loose on my tired frame. At 58, my body carried the weight of countless double shifts, aching feet, and a spine curved from years of leaning over tables. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and day-old pastries. The industrial coffee machine hissed and gurgled, competing with the clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. My hands, weathered and marked with small burns from too many rushed moments around hot plates, moved automatically through the opening routine. Wipe down tables, check the salt and pepper shakers, arrange the napkin dispensers just so. I'd learned long ago that survival in this job meant becoming invisible when convenient and hyper-visible when needed. Smile when spoken to, anticipate needs before they're voiced, absorb insults with the grace of a saint and the silence of a stone. Never, ever let them see you break. My apartment in Queens was a 30-minute subway ride away, a studio with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like a prisoner's chains. The rent consumed most of my paycheck, leaving little for luxuries like proper shoes or a winter coat that wasn't held together with safety pins and prayers. But it was mine. And after a lifetime of sharing spaces with family members who saw me only as a source of labor, solitude felt like freedom. I had 2 children, Sarah, 34, a marketing executive in Chicago, and Michael, 31, who worked construction in New Jersey. They called on holidays and birthdays, dutiful but distant. I understood. Their mother, the waitress, was an embarrassment they'd outgrown, a reminder of humble beginnings they preferred to forget. When they visited, which was rare, they spoke about their lives with careful enthusiasm while their eyes wandered to their phones. I served them dinner on my best plates and pretended not to notice their relief when it was time to leave. The other waitresses at Tony's came and went like seasons. Some were young college students working toward degrees that would take them far from this place. Others were women like me, trapped by circumstance and age in a job that demanded everything and offered little in return. We shared war stories during brief breaks, terrible customers, impossible orders, managers who treated us like expendable machinery. But mostly, we worked in companionable silence, each carrying our own invisible burdens. That Tuesday morning felt different from the moment I walked through the door. The air seemed charged, expectant, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Tony Marcelli, the owner, was already behind the counter, his thick fingers drumming against the cash register. At 65, Tony had the look of a man who'd built his small empire 1 cup of coffee at a time. His family had owned this corner of Manhattan for 3 generations, and he ran it with the iron fist of someone who'd never had to serve others. "Margaret," he called without looking up from his paperwork. "Table 6 needs attention. Some hotshot in a wheelchair. Apparently thinks he's too good to wait like everyone else." I followed his gesture toward the window table, our prime real estate, usually reserved for regulars who tipped well or tourists who photographed their food for social media. But the man sitting there wasn't taking pictures. He wasn't even looking at the menu I'd placed before him 20 minutes earlier. Jonathan Reed sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring out at the rain-slicked street with an expression I recognized all too well, the look of someone who'd learned to expect nothing good from the world. His suit was expensive, Italian probably, the kind that cost more than I made in 6 months. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and a gold watch caught the light on his wrist. But none of that wealth could disguise the deep sadness in his eyes or the tension in his shoulders as he braced against the cruelty of strangers. The other customers weren't even trying to hide their stares. A group of businessmen at table 4 whispered behind their newspapers, occasionally erupting in muffled laughter. 2 young women near the counter took selfies, angling their phones to capture his reflection in the background. An elderly couple shared a conversation punctuated by pointed glances and disapproving shakes of their heads. "Look at him," one of the businessmen said, just loud enough to be overheard, "probably faking it for sympathy. Rich boy playing victim." "Must be nice," his companion added. "Sit around all day collecting daddy's money while real people work for a living." I felt something hot and angry rise in my chest. These people didn't know anything about this man, yet they felt entitled to judge him, to turn his presence into entertainment for their ordinary lives. I'd spent decades watching this same cruelty play out, the way people found comfort in looking down on others, as if another person's perceived weakness made them stronger. When I approached his table, Jonathan looked up with the wariness of someone who'd learned to brace for impact. His eyes were green, flecked with gold, and held an intelligence that most people never bothered to notice. His hands, I observed, were strong despite whatever condition confined him to the wheelchair. They gripped a leather portfolio with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars. "I'm sorry for the wait," I said softly, pulling out my order pad. "What can I get started for you today?" Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at being addressed with simple courtesy. He'd been sitting there for nearly half an hour, and I was the first person to speak to him without mockery in my voice. "Coffee," he said, his voice cultured but careful. "Black. And maybe—" He glanced at the menu, then back at me. "What would you recommend?" It was such an ordinary question, the kind I answered dozens of times each day, but something in the way he asked it, genuinely interested in my opinion, treating me like someone whose thoughts mattered, caught me off guard. "The blueberry pancakes are good," I told him. "Fresh blueberries, real maple syrup. Tony's grandmother's recipe." He nodded and closed the menu. "That sounds perfect." As I walked away to place his order, I heard one of the businessmen mutter, "Probably can't even feed himself. What a waste." My hand tightened around my order pad, but I kept walking. In the kitchen, Maria, our cook, was already ladling batter onto the griddle. She'd worked at Tony's almost as long as I had, her calloused hands creating small miracles from simple ingredients. We exchanged a look. She'd heard the comments, too. "People are cruel," she said in her heavily accented English. "But you, Margaret, you have a good heart." I carried the coffee back to Jonathan's table, moving carefully through the increasingly crowded dining room. The lunch rush was beginning. And Tony expected perfection even when we were understaffed and overwhelmed. I set the cup down gently, along with cream and sugar he hadn't requested but might need. "Your pancakes will be out in just a few minutes," I said. "Thank you." He lifted the cup with steady hands. "I appreciate your kindness." Kindness. Such a simple word, yet it landed like a revelation. When was the last time someone had thanked me for being kind? Most days, I felt more like a vending machine than a human being. Insert order, receive food, exact change appreciated. The lunch crowd brought its usual chaos. Demanding customers who changed their minds 3 times, spilled drinks that needed immediate attention, complicated orders that required multiple trips to the kitchen. Through it all, I found myself glancing toward table 6, where Jonathan ate his pancakes with quiet dignity, while the world continued its subtle assault on his presence. A woman at table 9 snapped her fingers to get my attention, a gesture that never failed to make me feel like a trained animal. "Excuse me, but could you move that person?" She nodded toward Jonathan. "He's making my daughter uncomfortable." I followed her gaze to a girl of maybe 8 who was staring at Jonathan with the frank curiosity of childhood. She didn't look uncomfortable. She looked curious, maybe even fascinated by his wheelchair. It was her mother who couldn't bear to look at him. "I'm sorry, but that gentleman is enjoying his meal," I said as politely as possible. "Perhaps I could move you to another table." The woman's face flushed red. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to. My husband is a regular customer here. We shouldn't have to look at that while we're eating." The word "that" hung in the air like a slap. I glanced toward Jonathan, wondering if he'd heard, but his expression remained carefully neutral as he cut another piece of pancake. "I'll speak to my manager," I said, though we both knew Tony would side with whoever spent more money. But when I approached Tony behind the counter, he was already shaking his head. "Leave it alone, Margaret. The Harrison family drops $500 a week in here. We don't need trouble over some rich kid looking for attention." $500 a week. In Tony's world, that was the mathematics of human worth. Mrs. Harrison's discomfort mattered because it came attached to weekly profit margins. Jonathan's dignity was expendable because he was just one man, one meal, one transaction that could be sacrificed for the greater good of the bottom line. I returned to my section, moving through the familiar choreography of service while my mind churned. The afternoon stretched on, punctuated by small cruelties and casual indifferences. Jonathan finished his meal and paid with a credit card. I glimpsed the name Reed Holdings embossed in gold letters. He left a tip that was generous, but not ostentatious, the kind that suggested genuine appreciation rather than showing off. As he prepared to leave, maneuvering his wheelchair between closely placed tables, one of the businessmen from earlier made a show of pulling his chair back just as Jonathan approached. "Oops," the man said with false contrition. "Didn't see you there." Jonathan paused, his hands gripping his wheelchair's armrests. For a moment, I thought he might respond, might defend himself against the deliberate humiliation. Instead, he simply navigated around the obstacle with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to expect such treatment. At the door, he turned back once. Our eyes met across the crowded dining room, and he nodded, a small acknowledgement that passed between us like a secret. Then he was gone, leaving behind only the echo of cruel laughter and the bitter taste of injustice. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. I cleared his table, washing the dishes he'd used while wondering about the man who'd been sitting there. Jonathan Reed. The name suggested money, power, influence. Yet he'd been as vulnerable as any of us to the small cruelties that people inflicted on those they perceived as different. That evening, riding the subway home through the tunnel darkness, I found myself thinking about invisible wounds. Mine were carried in aching feet and tired shoulders, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small dismissals. But Jonathan seemed deeper somehow, the wounds of someone who wore his difference on the outside, making him a target for every stranger's need to feel superior. My apartment welcomed me with its familiar shabbiness. I heated a can of soup for dinner and sat at my small table, looking out at the lights of Queens stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in this vast city, Jonathan Reed was in his own home, probably something grand and expensive, filled with beautiful things that couldn't protect him from the cruelty of ordinary people. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of sneering faces and the sound of mocking laughter. I woke before my alarm, my body already preparing for another day of service, another series of small battles fought in silence. But as I dressed for work, pulling on the same faded uniform I'd worn for years, I made a decision. If Jonathan Reed returned to Tony's cafe, I would treat him not as an object of pity or curiosity, but as a human being deserving of respect. It seemed like such a small thing, but sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. The morning brought news that would change everything. Tony was waiting for me when I arrived, his face grave as he counted the previous day's receipts. "We got a complaint," he said without preamble. "The Harrison family. They don't want to see that wheelchair guy again. Bad for business," they said. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What does that mean? Means next time he comes in, we're full. You understand, Margaret? Sometimes we got to make hard choices. Hard choices. As if dignity was a luxury we couldn't afford, as if basic human decency was negotiable based on profit margins. I understood perfectly. I just didn't know if I could live with it. The breakfast crowd was lighter than usual, giving me time to think as I refilled coffee cups and took orders for eggs and toast. Around 10:30, I saw him through the window, Jonathan Reed, navigating his wheelchair along the sidewalk with the determined pace of someone who had somewhere important to be. He entered the cafe and looked toward his usual table by the window, but before he could move in that direction, Tony intercepted him with the false smile he reserved for difficult situations. "Sorry, buddy," Tony said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard. "We're completely booked today. Private party coming in." Jonathan's eyes swept the dining room, taking in the empty tables, the obvious lie hanging in the air like smoke. His expression didn't change, but I saw something die behind his eyes, that last flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, there was one place where he could exist without judgment. "I understand," he said quietly, already turning his wheelchair toward the door. But I couldn't let him leave. Not like this. Not when I had the power to offer him the one thing everyone else seemed determined to deny: simple human dignity. "Actually," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Table 6 just opened up. Right by the window, just like you prefer." The silence that followed was deafening. Tony's face went red, then white, then red again. Mrs. Harrison, who'd been enjoying her morning coffee at table 9, stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "This is unacceptable," she declared. "I specifically ask that this establishment maintain certain standards." "And we do," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "We serve good food to good people. That's our standard." Jonathan looked between me and Tony, understanding the battle being fought over his right to exist in peace. Something shifted in his posture, not quite hope, but maybe a flicker of gratitude that someone, finally, had chosen to stand beside him rather than against him. "Margaret." Tony's voice carried a warning that I chose to ignore. "Your usual table, Mr. Reed?" I asked, gesturing toward the window seat. He nodded and moved slowly across the dining room while conversations died around him. I walked beside his wheelchair, creating a small buffer zone against the stares and whispers that followed in our wake. "Coffee?" I asked as he settled at the table. "Please," he said. And there was something different in his voice now. Not the careful neutrality I'd heard before, but genuine warmth. "And Margaret, thank you." Those two words carried more weight than any tip, any praise, any recognition I'd ever received. They acknowledged not just my service, but my choice to see him as worthy of that service. The coffee was fresh and hot, steam rising from the cup like incense. I set it down carefully, along with a small plate of the butter cookies Maria made each morning. They weren't on the menu, just something special for customers who needed a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. "On the house," I said when he started to protest. As I walked away, I felt eyes following me from every corner of the dining room. Some were disapproving, others curious, a few perhaps even admiring. But for the first time in decades, I didn't care what any of them thought. I'd chosen compassion over commerce, humanity over profit, and that choice felt like freedom. The rest of the morning passed in relative peace. Mrs. Harrison left without finishing her coffee, muttering about standards and proper management. The businessmen from the day before found other tables to occupy, their crude jokes directed elsewhere. But Jonathan remained at table 6, working quietly on what appeared to be financial documents while sipping his coffee with obvious contentment. Around noon, he approached the counter where I was organizing receipts. Up close, I could see more clearly the toll that constant judgment had taken on him. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, a tension in his jaw that suggested words swallowed rather than spoken. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "Not just for the table, but for treating me like a person. You'd be surprised how rare that is." I wouldn't be surprised at all, but I didn't say that. Instead, I found myself asking, "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Reed?" "Jonathan, please." His smile was rueful. "I manage investments, mostly real estate and technology stocks, some cryptocurrency portfolios for clients who like to diversify. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills." The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, so dismissively, made me suspect those bills were considerably larger than mine. But there was no arrogance in his tone, none of the bluster I associated with wealthy customers who needed everyone to know about their success. "And you?" he asked. "How long have you been working here?" 37 years, I said, the number feeling heavy in my mouth. "Started when I was 21, fresh off the bus from Ohio." That's a lifetime of service." He seemed genuinely impressed rather than pitying. "You must have seen this neighborhood change completely." I had, of course. I'd watched storefronts transform from family businesses to corporate chains, seen young couples move in and families move out, witnessed the slow gentrification that pushed longtime residents to the margins. I'd served 3 generations of some families, watched children grow up and bring their own children for breakfast pancakes. "Change isn't always bad," I said carefully, "but sometimes it leaves people behind." Jonathan nodded, understanding passing between us. We were both, in our different ways, people the world had decided didn't quite fit its preferred narrative. He was too visible in his disability, I too invisible in my ordinary humanity. Over the following weeks, Jonathan became a regular fixture at table 6. He arrived most mornings around 10, ordered the same breakfast, blueberry pancakes, black coffee, occasionally adding scrambled eggs if he planned to work through lunch. He was unfailingly polite, tipped generously but not ostentatiously, and treated every member of our staff with the respect most customers reserved for their social equals. But his presence continued to divide our clientele. Some customers made a point of requesting tables on the opposite side of the dining room. Others stared openly, their conversations peppered with speculation about his condition, his wealth, his reasons for choosing our humble cafe over more upscale establishments. "Why does he keep coming here?" I overheard one woman ask her companion. "Surely someone like him could afford better." Someone like him, as if his wheelchair came with a catalog of appropriate dining establishments, as if his disability determined not just his mobility, but his right to exist in ordinary spaces. I began to understand that Jonathan's choice to return wasn't just about the pancakes or even my small kindnesses. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to hide away in the safe spaces society designated for people who made others uncomfortable. Every morning he claimed table 6. He was asserting his right to participate in the daily rituals of normal life. Our conversations grew longer and more personal. He told me about his education, Harvard Business School, followed by years learning the family business from his father. The Reed Holdings empire had been built over 3 generations, starting with his grandfather's small textile factory and evolving into a diversified investment portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "The wheelchair is a recent addition," he explained one quiet Tuesday morning. "Car accident 2 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light while I was crossing the street after a board meeting." His voice carried no self-pity, just the flat recitation of facts. "Shattered my spine in 3 places. The doctors said I was lucky to survive." Lucky. I wondered if he felt lucky as he navigated a world that saw his chair before it saw him, that reduced his worth to a medical diagnosis and a source of uncomfortable glances. My family adjusted, he continued with a bitter smile. My father moved me to an advisory role. Couldn't have a cripple representing the company after all. My fiancé found reasons to be elsewhere until our engagement quietly ended. Amazing how quickly people discover your true value when your circumstances change. The pain in his voice was recognizable to anyone who'd ever been discarded when they became inconvenient. I thought of my own children, so busy with their upwardly mobile lives, they rarely had time for their waitress mother. Love, I'd learned, often came with conditions that weren't revealed until you could no longer meet them. Their loss, I said simply, and meant it. During this time, Tony's attitude toward Jonathan's presence grew increasingly hostile. The complaints from certain customers had continued, and while Jonathan's business alone wasn't enough to offset the revenue from families like the Harrisons, his defiance of Tony's original ban had created an uncomfortable precedent. "He's trouble, Margaret," Tony warned me one morning as we prepared for the day. "Rich boy thinks he can buy his way into places he don't belong. We got a reputation to maintain." A reputation built on the backs of women like me, who'd served this neighborhood faithfully for decades while being treated as interchangeable parts in Tony's profit machine. But I held my tongue, understanding that my job hung by threads that grew thinner each day. The breaking point came on a Thursday in early November. Jonathan had been working at his usual table for over an hour, his laptop open beside a stack of financial documents. His morning coffee had grown cold as he concentrated on what appeared to be complex calculations involving stock portfolios and Bitcoin investments. Mrs. Harrison arrived with 3 friends, all dressed in the kind of expensive casual wear that screamed of personal shoppers and unlimited credit. They'd reserved the large corner table for what appeared to be a charity planning meeting, the kind of event where wealthy women organized fundraisers for causes that allowed them to feel virtuous without actually encountering the people they claimed to help. But Mrs. Me, Harrison's attention immediately fixed on Jonathan, her face contorting with the particular disgust reserved for people who refused to acknowledge their place in her vision of social hierarchy. "This is intolerable," she announced loudly enough to silence nearby conversations. "I specifically told Mr. Marcelli that we couldn't continue patronizing an establishment that caters to undesirable elements." Undesirable elements. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud, reducing Jonathan to something less than human, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. Jonathan's fingers paused on his laptop keyboard, but he didn't look up from his work. Years of such treatment had taught him the survival value of selective deafness, of pretending not to hear the cruel assessments of strangers. But I'd heard every word, felt each syllable like a physical blow. This man, this brilliant, kind, generous human being, was being dismissed as undesirable because his body didn't conform to Mrs. Harrison's aesthetic preferences. "Perhaps," I said, approaching their table with the calm professionalism I'd perfected over decades of difficult customers, "I could help you find a table that better suits your needs?" "What would suit our needs," Mrs. Harrison replied icily, "is an establishment that maintains appropriate standards for its clientele. That person's presence is disturbing and, frankly, unsanitary." Unsanitary. The word hit me like a slap, its casual cruelty taking my breath away. Jonathan's disability wasn't a medical condition to be managed with compassion. It was a contamination that threatened to spoil her refined dining experience. Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through decades of trained subservience. I looked at Mrs. Harrison and her friends, at their expensive clothes and manicured nails, at the casual entitlement that allowed them to dehumanize a stranger for their own comfort. "Ma'am," I said, my voice steady but carrying steel, "this is a public establishment. We serve anyone who can pay for their meal and treat our staff with respect. Mr. Reed is one of our most valued customers, and he's welcome here whether you approve or not." The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in the dining room ceased as customers turned to witness this unprecedented rebellion. Tony emerged from behind the counter, his face already red with anticipated conflict. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied, surprising myself with my calm. "These ladies are welcome to enjoy their meal, or they're welcome to leave. But they're not welcome to abuse another customer in my section." Mrs. Harrison's face had progressed through several shades of red to an alarming purple. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? My husband sits on the board of directors for half the businesses in this neighborhood. One phone call from me could shut this place down." "Then make your call," I said, and walked away. Behind me, I heard the scraping of chairs, the gathering of purses, the muttered threats about bad reviews and lost customers. But I also heard something else, the soft sound of applause. Not from the crowd of customers, who remained frozen in shocked silence, but from Jonathan, who was clapping slowly, quietly, his eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like pride. Tony's explosion, when it came, was volcanic. He waited until Mrs. Harrison and her friends had stormed out before turning on me with the full force of his accumulated rage. 37 years, Margaret. 37 years you've been working here, and now you throw it away for what? Some rich boy who probably don't even need our sympathy?" "It's not about sympathy," I tried to explain. "It's about basic human decency." "Decency don't pay the bills," Tony's voice boomed across the dining room. "The Harrison family brings in $26,000 a year in business. $26,000. What's he bring in? A few hundred a month in coffee and pancakes? The mathematics of human worth. Calculated in dollars and cents. Mrs. Harrison's cruelty was valuable because it came attached to profit margins. Jonathan's dignity was expendable because kindness didn't show up on quarterly reports. "You're fired," Tony said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Clean out your locker and get out. I don't never want to see you in here again." 37 years of service ended in a moment of moral clarity. I untied my apron with hands that shook only slightly, folded it into a neat square, and placed it on the counter. Around me, the dining room remained silent, customers and staff alike paralyzed by the sudden violence of my dismissal. As I walked toward the door, I passed Jonathan's table one last time. He looked up from his laptop, his green eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Margaret," he said softly, "I'm sorry. This is my fault." "No," I replied, and for the first time in years, I felt completely certain about something. "This is theirs." The November air hit me like a slap as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Behind me, the familiar sounds of the cafe continued. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of conversation. But I was no longer part of that world. After 37 years, I'd been cast out for the crime of treating another human being with dignity. I walked slowly toward the subway, my legs unsteady beneath me. In my purse was my final paycheck, 2 weeks' pay minus the cost of the uniform I'd allegedly damaged, leaving me with barely enough to cover next month's rent. At 58, I was unemployed, with no prospects, no savings, and no safety net beyond my own stubborn refusal to give up. But as I descended into the underground, surrounded by the familiar smells of exhaust and humanity, I felt something unexpected blooming in my chest. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of fierce satisfaction. For once in my invisible life, I'd chosen principle over practicality, dignity over dollars. It had cost me everything, but it had also revealed something precious, the knowledge that even a worn-out waitress could still surprise herself. The train ride to Queens passed in a blur of stops and stations. I stared at my reflection in the dark windows, seeing not the defeated woman I expected, but someone who looked strangely liberated. The uniform was gone, the forced smile abandoned, the careful deference that had defined my professional life finally set aside. My apartment welcomed me with its familiar shabbiness, but now it felt less like a refuge and more like a prison. Without my job, I couldn't afford to stay. Without references from Tony, I couldn't find another position. At 58, with only food service experience and a high school diploma, my options were limited to minimum wage positions that would barely cover rent, much less food and utilities. I made a cup of tea and sat at my small table, looking out at the gray November sky. Somewhere in Manhattan, Jonathan Reed was probably finishing his morning coffee, wondering if my sacrifice had been worth the cost. I hoped he would continue to claim Table 6, continue to assert his right to exist in ordinary spaces despite the discomfort of ordinary people. The phone rang as darkness settled over Queens. I expected it to be a telemarketer, or maybe one of my children with their dutiful weekly check-in. Instead, I heard a voice I'd never expected to hear in my home. "Margaret? This is Jonathan Reed. I hope you don't mind. I got your number from the cafe's employee directory. I had to call to apologize." "You don't owe me any apology," I said, surprised by how glad I was to hear his voice. "Yes, I do. You lost your job because of me, because you chose to defend someone you barely know. That kind of courage, it's rare, precious, and it shouldn't have cost you everything." His words carried the weight of genuine remorse, but also something else. A recognition that what had happened between us transcended the ordinary boundaries of customer and server, stranger and friend. "I made my choice," I told him. "For the first time in decades, I chose what was right instead of what was safe. I can live with that. But you shouldn't have to suffer for it." There was determination in his voice now, the sound of decisions being made. "I have a proposition for you if you're willing to listen." I listened, and what I heard changed the trajectory of my life in ways I could never have imagined. Jonathan's proposition was both simple and revolutionary. He owned property throughout Manhattan, office buildings, retail spaces, residential complexes that generated income through rent and appreciation. Most were managed by large corporate firms that treated properties as numbers on a balance sheet rather than communities to be nurtured. "I want to open a cafe," he said, "not a corporate chain or a trendy boutique, but a real neighborhood gathering place. Somewhere people can come for good food, fair prices, and the kind of human decency that seems to be going extinct." The vision he described was everything Tony's Cafe could have been, but never was. A place where profit didn't come at the expense of compassion, where customers and staff were treated as human beings rather than economic units. "And I want you to manage it," he continued. "Full partnership, profit sharing, complete authority over hiring and operations. Your 37 years of experience make you the most qualified person I know to create the kind of place where everyone belongs." Partnership. The word felt foreign on my tongue, laden with possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. For nearly 4 decades, I'd been an employee, interchangeable and expendable. The idea that someone saw me as valuable enough to share ownership, to trust with meaningful responsibility, was almost too large to comprehend. "I can't match your investment," I said. "I don't have capital or business experience or—" "You have something more valuable," Jonathan interrupted. "You understand what real service means. You know how to make people feel welcome, how to create the kind of atmosphere that turns customers into community. That's not something you can buy or learn from textbooks." We talked for over an hour, our conversation flowing from practical considerations to shared dreams about what hospitality could be when it emerged from genuine care rather than calculated profit. As we spoke, I felt something stirring in my chest that had been dormant for years, hope, mixed with the terrifying excitement of possibility. The cafe would be located in a ground floor space in one of Jonathan's buildings, a corner location in the Upper West Side with large windows and enough room for 30 tables. The previous tenant had been a failed upscale restaurant that never understood its neighborhood, too expensive for locals, too ordinary for tourists, doomed by the kind of pretension that alienated everyone it tried to serve. "We'll start simple," Jonathan explained. "Good coffee, honest breakfast, and lunch food, prices that won't bankrupt working people. The kind of place where a construction worker can sit next to a banker and both feel equally welcome." It sounded like paradise to someone who'd spent decades navigating the arbitrary hierarchies of restaurant service, where customers' worth was measured by their ability to generate profit rather than their fundamental humanity. But even as hope bloomed in my chest, practical concerns crowded around it like weeds. Starting a business, even with a partner's financial backing, was an enormous risk. At 58, I was betting my future on an industry I'd only ever experienced from the serving side. What if I failed? What if years of taking orders had left me unprepared to give them? "You're scared," Jonathan observed, reading my silence with the perceptiveness I'd come to associate with people who'd learned to pay attention to unspoken communication. "Terrified," I admitted. "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. Confidence without fear is just arrogance. And we've both had enough of that to last a lifetime." His words carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between true strength and the brittle illusion of invulnerability. The car accident that had shattered his spine had also shattered his assumptions about control, success, and the permanence of any circumstances. "When do we start?" I asked, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Tomorrow, if you're ready. I've had my lawyers drawing up the partnership agreements, and the lease is ready to sign. We could have the doors open by spring if we work through the winter." Spring. The word carried promise, the possibility of resurrection after a long season of dormancy. I thought of Tony's Cafe, where Mrs. Harrison's prejudice still held court and Jonathan's dignity remained unwelcome. Our cafe would be different, a place where worth was measured not by wealth or appearance, but by the simple act of treating others with respect. The next morning, I rode the subway into Manhattan with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. Instead of the familiar blue uniform, I wore my best dress, a simple navy outfit I'd bought for Sarah's wedding 3 years earlier. Instead of reporting to Tony for another day of invisible service, I was meeting with lawyers to become a business owner. The Reed Holdings office occupied 2 floors of a gleaming tower in Midtown, its reception area decorated with abstract art and fresh flowers. The receptionist greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that acknowledged my importance rather than assessing my economic value. When Jonathan emerged from the elevator, dressed in a charcoal suit that emphasized the strength of his shoulders, I felt a moment of disorientation. This was the same man who'd been dismissed as undesirable at Tony's Cafe, yet here he commanded obvious respect and deference. "Margaret," he said, rolling forward to greet me with a smile that held no trace of the wariness I'd become accustomed to seeing in his eyes. "Ready to become a restaurateur?" The legal papers were thick with clauses and subclauses, but the essential terms were remarkably straightforward. We would be equal partners in Reed Donovan Cafe. He'd insisted on including my maiden name in the business title, with shared authority over all major decisions. His initial investment would cover renovation, equipment, and 6 months of operating expenses. My contribution would be expertise, management, and what the lawyers termed sweat equity, the labor of bringing our vision to life. "Reed Donovan Cafe," I repeated, testing how the words felt in my mouth. After decades of being just Margaret the waitress, seeing my name on official documents was startling and wonderful. The space itself was both promising and daunting. Located on Columbus Avenue, it had good foot traffic from nearby residential buildings and the subway station. The previous restaurant's decor was aggressively modern, all sharp angles and cold surfaces that seemed designed to discourage lingering. But beneath the pretentious finishes, I could see the bones of something warm and welcoming. "What do you envision?" Jonathan asked as we stood in the empty dining room, our voices echoing off bare walls. I closed my eyes and let my imagination fill the space with the sounds and smells of the cafe I'd always wanted to create. Round tables instead of sharp squares, comfortable chairs that invited conversation, warm colors that made people feel embraced rather than impressed, a menu written on chalkboards rather than printed on expensive paper, flowers on every table, nothing fancy, just whatever was in season at the local market. Community, I said finally. I want to create a place where people matter more than profit, where the barista knows your name and the server remembers how you take your coffee, where a retired teacher can afford lunch and a corporate executive feels comfortable striking up a conversation with a struggling artist. Jonathan nodded, his eyes bright with shared vision. No reserved tables for VIPs. No discrimination based on appearance or perceived ability to pay big tips. Everyone gets treated with the same respect. It was a radical concept in the restaurant industry, where customers were routinely sorted into hierarchies based on their economic value. But it was also the natural extension of the kindness we'd shared across Table 6, the recognition that dignity shouldn't be a luxury item available only to those who could afford it. The renovation took 4 months of 12-hour days, with both of us working alongside contractors and designers to create something that honored our vision without breaking our budget. Jonathan proved surprisingly handy with practical tasks, his wheelchair-accessible perspective helping us identify barriers that able-bodied designers might have missed. I discovered talents I didn't know I possessed, an eye for color and texture that transformed the stark space into something warm and inviting. We hired carefully, looking not just for experience, but for the kind of character that aligned with our values. Maria, the cook from Tony's, joined us as head chef, bringing her magical touch with simple ingredients and her grandmother's recipe for the kind of comfort food that nourish souls as well as bodies. David, a young man struggling to balance college classes with work, became our morning barista, his genuine smile and careful attention to coffee preparation, helping establish the kind of atmosphere where customers felt valued rather than hurried. The menu we developed was deliberately simple: excellent coffee, fresh pastries, hearty breakfast plates, and lunch dishes that combined quality ingredients with reasonable prices. No molecular gastronomy or trendy fusion experiments, just honest food prepared with care and served with warmth. I want a teacher to be able to afford lunch here without feeling guilty, I explained to Jonathan as we finalized prices. And I want that teacher to sit next to a lawyer and have both of them feel equally welcome. As opening day approached, I found myself both excited and terrified. Everything I'd learned about hospitality had been filtered through Tony's emphasis on profit over people. Now I would have the chance to create something different, but I would also bear the responsibility if our idealism proved economically unsustainable. The night before we opened, Jonathan and I sat in the finished dining room, sharing a bottle of wine and marveling at what we'd created together. The space glowed with warm light from fixtures we'd chosen for their ability to make everyone look good, regardless of age or circumstances. The walls displayed artwork from local artists, not because it was expensive, but because it was beautiful and celebrated the creativity in our neighborhood. "Do you think we can make this work?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as reality approached. "We already have," Jonathan replied. "Not financially, that remains to be seen. But we've created something that didn't exist before, a space where people like us can feel at home. That's success, regardless of what the profit and loss statements say. People like us." I understood what he meant: those who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or valued only for their utility to others. Our cafe would be a refuge for anyone who'd ever felt invisible, unwelcome, or reduced to their circumstances, rather than celebrated for their humanity. Opening day dawned gray and drizzly, typical March weather that seemed to match my nervous energy. We'd advertised minimally, just a simple sign announcing our hours and a few flyers distributed to nearby buildings. Everything would depend on word of mouth, on whether our vision of inclusive hospitality would resonate with the neighbors we hoped to serve. The first customer arrived at 6:30, 15 minutes after we unlocked the doors. She was an elderly woman with a worn coat and careful eyes, the kind of person who'd learned to assess whether she was welcome before fully entering a space. "Good morning," I said, approaching her with the same warmth I would have shown my own grandmother. "Welcome to Reed Donovan. What can I get started for you?" She ordered coffee and a blueberry muffin, examining the prices with visible relief when she realized they wouldn't strain her fixed income. As I served her, I noticed her looking around the dining room with the wonder of someone discovering an unexpected gift. "It's so bright and cheerful," she said. "Most places these days are either too fancy or too fast. This feels comfortable." Comfortable. It wasn't the sexiest compliment we could have received, but it was exactly what we'd hoped for. Comfort suggested a place where people could let down their guard, where they could exist without performance or pretense. By mid-morning, we had a steady stream of customers, construction workers grabbing coffee before job sites, mothers with strollers taking refuge from the drizzle, seniors appreciating both the reasonable prices and the unhurried atmosphere. Each interaction felt like a small victory, a confirmation that our philosophy of radical hospitality could work in practice as well as theory. Around 11, I saw a familiar figure through the rain-streaked window. Mrs. Harrison stood on the sidewalk staring at our cheerful facade with an expression of profound distaste. For a moment, I thought she might enter, might give us a chance to demonstrate that civility didn't require exclusion. Instead, she pulled out her phone, took a photo of our storefront, and walked away with the purposeful stride of someone planning mischief. "Trouble?" Jonathan asked, following my gaze. "Probably," I admitted, but we knew this wouldn't be easy. The challenges came sooner than expected. Within a week, we received our first negative online reviews, anonymous postings that criticized everything from our shabby decor to our unprofessional staff. The complaints were too detailed and coordinated to be coincidental, clearly the work of someone with both motivation and resources to damage our reputation before we could establish ourselves. But for every artificial negative review, we received 2 genuine positive ones. Customers appreciated not just our food and service, but the atmosphere we'd created. A place where differences in age, race, economic status, and physical ability didn't determine treatment or welcome. Parents brought children who were welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Seniors lingered over coffee without pressure to vacate their tables for more profitable customers. Young people studying for exams found a place where they could afford to sit for hours without guilt. 3 months after opening, we achieved something remarkable. Not just financial sustainability, but the creation of genuine community. Regulars knew each other's names and stories. Informal study groups formed at corner tables. Business deals were negotiated between neighbors who'd met over morning coffee. What we'd envisioned as a cafe had evolved into something rarer and more valuable, a place where the loneliness of urban life could be temporarily set aside. The vindication came from an unexpected source. Jonathan was reviewing our quarterly financial reports when he noticed a pattern in our credit card transactions. Several payments showed unusually large tips attached to modest orders, amounts that seemed disproportionate to the cost of coffee and pastries. "Look at this," he said, showing me the data on his laptop screen. "Mrs. Catherine Murphy, 83 years old, orders tea and a scone twice a week. Total bill is usually around $7, but her tips are $50, sometimes $100. I remembered Mrs. Murphy, a tiny woman with silver hair who always sat by the window, reading library books while her tea grew cold. She was unfailingly polite, but rarely spoke beyond placing her order. I'd assumed she was living on a pension, careful with every dollar. "Maybe it's a mistake," I suggested. "Credit card fraud or accidentally hitting the wrong amount." But as we examined other transactions, we found similar patterns. Elderly customers who appeared to be counting pennies were leaving tips that suggested significant wealth. Young people dressed in expensive clothes were paying exact amounts to the cent. Our assumptions about economic status based on appearance were being systematically disproven. The mystery deepened when David, our morning barista, mentioned overhearing a phone conversation. Mrs. Murphy had been talking to someone about dividend payments and portfolio adjustments while stirring her tea. Another regular, an elderly man who always ordered the cheapest item on our menu, had been discussing real estate investments and Bitcoin holdings with a companion. They're hiding their wealth, Jonathan realized, coming here specifically because we don't treat them differently based on what they can afford. The revelation was both humbling and profound. We'd created a space where wealthy people could experience ordinary human kindness without the complications of their financial status. They could be treated well simply for being human beings, not because servers hoped for large tips or business owners saw potential investors. But our success also attracted less welcome attention. Tony Marcelli appeared one afternoon, his face red with indignation as he surveyed our busy dining room. He'd heard about our thriving business through the restaurant community's gossip network, and his anger was palpable. "So this is where you ended up," he said, approaching my position behind the counter. "Helping rich boy here steal customers from honest businesses." "We're not stealing anyone," I replied calmly. "We're just offering good service to good people." "Good people?" Tony's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby tables. "Half these customers used to come to my place. You poison them against me with your sob story, make me look like the villain for running a real business." I looked at him, this man who'd employed me for 37 years, who'd fired me for defending another human being's dignity, and felt not anger, but something closer to pity. Tony lived in a world where kindness was weakness, where humanity was a luxury that interfered with profit margins. He couldn't understand that our success wasn't built on taking his customers, but on treating all customers as worthy of respect. Your business, your choice. "Tony," I said, "this is ours." He left without ordering anything, muttering threats about unfair competition and poaching employees. But his visit served as a reminder that not everyone appreciated our vision of inclusive hospitality. Success had made us visible, and visibility brought scrutiny from those who preferred the old hierarchies. The real test came 6 months later, when autumn brought the kind of busy season that could establish our reputation permanently. The neighborhood had embraced us not just as a cafe, but as a gathering place, somewhere people could count on finding warmth and welcome, regardless of their circumstances. It was during this period that I received a phone call that would change everything once again. The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with the careful diction of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "Ms. Donovan, this is Patricia Williams from Williams & Associates. I've been trying to reach you regarding your partnership with Jonathan Reed." My heart clenched with sudden fear. Had something happened to Jonathan? Was there legal trouble with our business? Had the anonymous complaints and negative reviews escalated into something more serious? "What is this about?" I asked. "I represent several investors who are interested in acquiring Reed Donovan Cafe. They're prepared to offer a substantial sum for your partnership share, enough to ensure your financial security for life." The number she quoted was staggering, more money than I'd imagined earning in a lifetime of service. It represented freedom from financial worry, the ability to retire comfortably, to travel or pursue interests I'd never been able to afford. But it also represented the end of everything Jonathan and I had built together. "Why?" I asked. "Why would anyone want to buy out a small neighborhood cafe?" "Your location is prime real estate. The investors plan to renovate and rebrand as an upscale establishment that better reflects the neighborhood's demographics. They see significant profit potential in a more exclusive clientele." Exclusive. The word carried the poison of everything we'd fought against. The idea that worth was determined by wealth, that comfort should be available only to those who could afford premium prices. They wanted to buy our cafe not to preserve what we'd created, but to destroy it, to transform our inclusive community into another monument to economic segregation. "I'm not interested," I said firmly. "Ms. Donovan, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. This offer represents financial independence, the chance to secure your future without the risks of business ownership. At your age, shouldn't security be your primary concern?" At my age. Another subtle dismissal. The suggestion that older people should be grateful for any offer that promised comfort over purpose. But I'd spent too many years accepting less than I deserved to be tempted by their vision of golden prison. "My answer is no," I repeated, "and it will remain no." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Queen's skyline, wrestling with doubt. The money they'd offered could have solved every practical problem I faced: health insurance, retirement savings, the constant worry about what would happen when I became too old to work. Wasn't it foolish to reject security for the sake of principle? But then I thought about Mrs. Murphy, counting out exact change for her tea while secretly managing a fortune. About David, proud to serve coffee to customers who saw him as more than just hired help. About Jonathan, who'd found in our cafe not just a business partner, but a place where his disability didn't define his welcome. I thought about all the customers who'd told us our cafe felt like home, who'd found in our warm chaos a refuge from a world that constantly assessed their worth. Could I be the one to sell that sanctuary to people who saw community as an obstacle to profit? The next morning, I arrived at the cafe early to find Jonathan already there, reviewing paperwork at his usual table. His expression was troubled, and I realized he'd received a similar phone call. "They approached you too," I said, settling into the chair across from him. He nodded grimly. "Offered me twice what you were quoted. Apparently, they think men are harder to persuade than women." The casual sexism shouldn't have surprised me, but it still stung. Even in business negotiations, I was seen as the weaker link, the one more likely to be swayed by financial pressure. "Are you tempted?" I asked. Jonathan's smile was rueful. 2 years ago, I would have taken their money without hesitation. Before the accident, I measured everything in profit margins and growth potential. But this place... He gestured around the dining room, where early customers were already settling in with newspapers and coffee. This place taught me the difference between price and value. We spent the rest of the morning discussing our options, but we both knew our choice had been made the moment we'd opened our doors to everyone who needed welcome. The cafe represented more than a business venture. It was proof that different values could create sustainable success, that kindness wasn't weakness, but strength in its most practical form. The pressure escalated over the following weeks. Anonymous complaints to city health inspectors brought surprise visits that found no violations but created disruption and anxiety. Negative online reviews multiplied, many clearly fake but damaging nonetheless. Delivery trucks began experiencing mysterious difficulties, finding our address, forcing us to pick up supplies ourselves. But our community rallied in ways that surprised even me. Customers organized their own positive review campaigns, sharing stories about how our cafe had touched their lives. Mrs. Murphy, revealed as a retired investment banker with a portfolio worth millions, organized a group of wealthy seniors who made our space their unofficial club headquarters. David's college friends brought study groups that filled our afternoon hours with the energy of young people planning their futures. The campaign against us reached its peak on a gray November morning, exactly 1 year after my firing from Tony's. I arrived to find broken glass on the sidewalk and graffiti spray-painted across our front window, ugly words suggesting that places like ours didn't belong in neighborhoods like this. But as I stood there with a broom and bucket, trying to clean away the evidence of someone's hatred, I wasn't alone. Jonathan emerged from a taxi, having come as soon as I called him. Mrs. Murphy appeared with a thermos of tea and a fierce expression that dared anyone to mess with her cafe. David arrived early for his shift and immediately began helping with the cleanup. Within an hour, other customers and neighbors had joined the effort. Someone brought coffee from the bodega next door. Another person arrived with glass cleaner and paper towels. A retired teacher who'd never spoken to us beyond ordering her daily muffin began carefully scraping paint from our window while muttering about people who had nothing better to do than destroy beautiful things. As I watched our community respond to attack with voluntary service, I understood something profound about the resistance we were facing. Our cafe threatened not just the economic interests of those who wanted to gentrify it out of existence, but the social hierarchies that kept people separated and suspicious of each other. We'd proven that different kinds of people could coexist with mutual respect, and that threatened those who profited from division. "They can't stop us," Mrs. Murphy said quietly as she handed me a cup of tea. "Places like this are too important to lose." She was right, but the battle was far from over. The real challenge wouldn't be external pressure, but our own ability to sustain what we'd created without losing the values that made it special. Success brought its own temptations: the pressure to expand rapidly, to franchise our concept, to transform our intimate community space into a corporate enterprise. But as I looked around at our neighbors cleaning graffiti and sharing coffee, I knew we'd found something worth fighting for. Reed Donovan Cafe wasn't just a business. It was a daily affirmation that dignity shouldn't depend on circumstances, that kindness was possible even in a world that often rewarded cruelty. The year that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. We weathered seasonal fluctuations and economic pressures, learned to balance idealism with practical necessity, and slowly built the kind of financial stability that allowed us to focus on our mission rather than mere survival. Jonathan's transformation was as remarkable as the cafe's success. The bitter, defensive man I'd first met at Tony's had evolved into someone whose confidence came not from wealth or status, but from the knowledge that he was contributing something valuable to the world. His disability, rather than being something to hide or overcome, became an asset that helped us create a more inclusive environment for everyone. My own journey was equally profound. After decades of being invisible, of serving others while my own needs went unrecognized, I discovered that my experience wasn't just valuable, it was essential. Every skill I developed as a waitress, reading people's moods, anticipating needs, managing difficult personalities, proved crucial to building our community. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with my own worth. For the first time in my adult life, I was valued not for my utility to others, but for my inherent dignity as a person. The partnership with Jonathan wasn't charity or pity. It was recognition that what I brought to our collaboration was irreplaceable. As our second anniversary approached, we received an invitation that seemed to complete a circle I hadn't realized we were drawing. The local restaurant association wanted to honor us with an award for community service, recognizing our cafe as a model for inclusive business practices. The ceremony was held at a hotel ballroom filled with food service professionals, business owners, and community leaders. I found myself seated at a table with people whose opinions had once seemed beyond my reach: restaurant critics, successful entrepreneurs, city officials who shaped policy for small businesses. But as I looked around the room, I realized how much had changed, not just in my circumstances, but in my fundamental understanding of human worth. These people, impressive as their achievements might be, were no more inherently valuable than Mrs. Murphy counting change for her tea, or David carefully crafting lattes for morning commuters, or any of the customers who'd found refuge in our warm chaos. When our names were called and Jonathan and I made our way to the podium to accept the award, I felt the weight of representation. We weren't just being honored for running a successful business. We were being recognized for proving that different values could create sustainable prosperity. "This award," I said, gripping the microphone with hands that had served countless cups of coffee, "belongs to every person who chose kindness over convenience, who treated strangers like family, who proved that community isn't just a nice idea, but a practical necessity." The applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition usually offered at such events. It carried genuine warmth. the acknowledgement of people who understood that what we'd accomplished went beyond profit margins or customer satisfaction scores. After the ceremony, as Jonathan and I rode back to Queens in a taxi filled with the comfortable silence of shared accomplishment, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. 2 years earlier, I'd been fired for defending a stranger's dignity. Tonight, I'd been honored for building a business on that same principle. "Any regrets?" Jonathan asked as we crossed the Queensboro Bridge, its lights reflecting off the East River like scattered diamonds. I thought about the question seriously. Regrets about the years I'd spent accepting less than I deserved? Yes. About the time I'd wasted believing that my worth was determined by others' assessment of my utility? Absolutely. But about the choice that had cost me everything and given me so much more? None, I said, and meant it completely. The taxi dropped me at my apartment building, but I wasn't ready to go inside. Instead, I walked to the small park across the street and sat on a bench overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere in those glittering towers were people like the ones who'd tried to buy our cafe, who saw community as an obstacle to profit, who believed worth could be measured in dollars and cents. But there were also people like Mrs. Murphy, hiding fortunes behind ordinary kindness. Like David, serving coffee with genuine care despite having every reason to be cynical about customer service. Like Jonathan, who'd learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. And there were people like me, invisible for so long that we'd forgotten our own worth, but capable of extraordinary things when someone finally saw our value. The waitress who'd been fired for defending a stranger had become a business owner whose success was built on that same principle. As I sat there in the Queen's darkness, I understood something that had taken 60 years to learn. Dignity isn't something others give you or take away. It's something you claim for yourself, one choice at a time. One moment of courage building on another until you become the person you were always meant to be. The cafe would face new challenges: economic downturns, changing neighborhoods, the constant pressure to choose profit over principle. But it had already accomplished its most important purpose, proving that a different way was possible, that businesses could succeed by honoring human worth rather than exploiting human weakness. Tomorrow I would wake before dawn and ride the subway into Manhattan, just as I had for decades. But this time, I wouldn't be invisible. I wouldn't be serving others while my own needs went unrecognized. I would be walking into a space I'd helped create, where dignity wasn't a luxury item, but the foundation of every interaction. The thought filled me with quiet satisfaction as I finally headed home. In a few hours, our cafe would open its doors to another day of small miracles. Strangers becoming neighbors, differences bridged by shared humanity, worth recognized without regard to wealth or status. It had taken a disabled millionaire and an invisible waitress to prove that kindness wasn't just nice. It was profitable in the ways that mattered most. Not just financial success, but the creation of meaning, the building of community. The daily affirmation that every person deserved to be seen, valued, and welcomed. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I carried with me not just the memory of tonight's recognition, but the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. Each day brought new chances to choose dignity over convenience, humanity over hierarchy, love over indifference. And in that choice, repeated countless times by countless people, lay the quiet revolution that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. It started with something as simple as treating a disabled man with courtesy rather than cruelty, defending a stranger's right to exist in peace, believing that every person who walked through our doors carried infinite worth regardless of their circumstances. The key turned easily in my apartment door, and I stepped inside, knowing that tomorrow and every day after, I would wake not as someone who served others, but as someone who served with others, building something beautiful from the simple recognition that we all deserve better than a world that measures worth in dollars and dismisses dignity as weakness. But our story was far from over. 3 years into our partnership, Jonathan and I faced a test that would challenge not just our business model, but the very principles we'd built our lives upon. It began with a letter delivered on a cold January morning. The envelope bore the official seal of the city's Department of Health, and inside was a notice that made my hands tremble as I read it aloud to Jonathan over our morning coffee. Reed Donovan Cafe is hereby notified of a formal complaint regarding alleged violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. An investigation has been initiated following reports that the establishment discriminates against patrons with visible disabilities by segregating them to specific seating areas and creating an atmosphere of excessive attention that violates their right to dignity and privacy. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. Our cafe, built on the principle of inclusive hospitality, was being accused of the very discrimination we'd fought against. Someone had weaponized the law designed to protect people like Jonathan, turning it into an instrument of attack against the space where he'd found refuge. "Mrs. Harrison," Jonathan said quietly, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "This has her fingerprints all over it." The investigation that followed was thorough and invasive. Inspectors arrived unannounced, documenting every aspect of our operation with the cold efficiency of bureaucratic machinery. They interviewed customers, staff, and neighbors, asking leading questions designed to uncover evidence of the discrimination we were allegedly practicing. "Do you feel that disabled customers are treated differently here?" they asked Mrs. Murphy, who responded with a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Yes," she said. "They're treated like human beings instead of problems to be solved. If that's discrimination, we need more of it." But the investigation created an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned the comfortable community we'd worked so hard to build. Customers who'd never questioned our practices suddenly noticed every interaction, wondering if kindness was actually condescension, if inclusion was really segregation in disguise. David, our loyal barista, became increasingly anxious as the scrutiny intensified. "What if we're doing something wrong without knowing it?" he asked during a particularly difficult afternoon. "What if trying to help actually hurt?" It was the question that haunted all of us during those dark winter months. In our desire to create a welcoming space, had we inadvertently created new forms of exclusion? Was our celebration of difference actually another way of marking people as other? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a disability rights advocate who'd been following our case, requested a meeting with Jonathan and me. I expected another interrogation, more questions designed to expose our hidden prejudices. Instead, she arrived at our cafe on a snowy February evening after closing time, accompanied by 3 other wheelchair users and a woman with a guide dog. They settled around our largest table with the easy familiarity of old friends, creating an impromptu support group in our empty dining room. "We've been coming here individually for months," Dr. Rodriguez explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to fighting battles others preferred to ignore. "Some of us traveled from other boroughs because we heard about a place where we could just exist, where our wheelchairs and guide dogs and visible differences weren't the first thing people noticed." One of her companions, a young man with cerebral palsy whose speech required patience to understand, added his perspective with careful determination. "Most places, they either ignore us completely or make such a big deal about helping that everyone stares. Here, the help is quiet, natural, like how you'd treat anyone." As they spoke, sharing stories about their experiences in our cafe and comparing them to the daily indignities they faced elsewhere, I began to understand the true nature of the attack being mounted against us. It wasn't really about disability rights or discrimination. It was about destroying something that threatened the comfortable hierarchies that determined who belonged where in society. The complaint alleges that we segregate disabled customers, Jonathan said, his voice heavy with frustration. But you're saying we do the opposite. Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Integration without assimilation. You've created a space where being different isn't a problem to be solved or hidden. That terrifies people who profit from keeping us separated and ashamed. The woman with the guide dog, who'd introduced herself as Sarah Chen, a law professor at Columbia, leaned forward with the intensity of someone accustomed to complex legal battles. The complaint specifically mentions that disabled patrons are given excessive attention and made to feel conspicuous. But what they're really objecting to is visibility without shame. You've made it acceptable for us to exist in public without apologizing for taking up space. I thought about Jonathan's daily ritual of claiming table 6, his refusal to hide in corners or disappear into spaces deemed appropriate for people like him. His wheelchair had been a mark of distinction in the worst possible way when he first entered our world, something that made him a target for every stranger's discomfort and cruelty. But in our cafe, it had become simply another fact about him, no more remarkable than his taste for blueberry pancakes or his skill with financial analysis. They're not trying to protect disabled people, I realized aloud. They're trying to make us invisible again. The legal proceedings stretched through the spring, a bureaucratic nightmare of depositions and documentation that consumed time and energy we needed for running our business. Our lawyer, a fierce advocate for small business rights, warned us that the process could drag on for years, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Even if you win, she explained during a particularly frustrating meeting, the cost of defending yourselves could destroy your business. That might be the real goal. But something unexpected happened as the investigation dragged on. Our community, rather than being destroyed by suspicion, was strengthened by adversity. Customers organized in ways that surprised everyone, creating informal networks of support that transcended the boundaries of our physical space. Mrs. Murphy convened regular meetings of what she called Margaret's Army, a group of elderly customers who'd made the cafe their unofficial headquarters. They coordinated positive social media campaigns, organized letter-writing drives to city officials, and created a legal defense fund that grew with donations ranging from pensioners' $5 bills to anonymous checks for thousands of dollars. David's college friends, initially skeptical about joining what they saw as a fight between adults with more resources than they possessed, gradually became some of our most effective advocates. They understood social media in ways that older supporters didn't, creating viral content that told our story to audiences we never could have reached on our own. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation forced us to articulate something we'd been practicing intuitively: the difference between charity and dignity, between helping and empowering, between inclusion that homogenizes and inclusion that celebrates difference. We don't serve disabled customers, I found myself explaining to yet another investigator. We serve customers, some of whom happen to be disabled. The difference might seem subtle, but it's everything. Jonathan, during his own deposition, was asked to explain why he chose to frequent an establishment that allegedly made him feel conspicuous. Because it was the first place where I didn't feel ashamed, he replied. Not because they pretended my wheelchair didn't exist, but because they treated it as ordinary, revolutionary ordinary. Revolutionary ordinary. The phrase stuck with me as we navigated the maze of legal challenges and community support. We hadn't set out to change the world. We'd simply tried to create a space where everyone could exist without apology. But in a society built on hierarchies of worth, treating everyone as equally deserving of dignity and respect was indeed revolutionary. The resolution, when it finally came, was both anticlimactic and profound. After 8 months of investigation, the Department of Health found no evidence of discrimination. The complaint was dismissed with a terse official letter that revealed nothing about the political pressures or personal vendettas that had triggered the entire ordeal. But the real victory wasn't in the legal vindication. It was in discovering that our community was stronger than the forces arrayed against it. We'd weathered a coordinated attack designed to destroy not just our business, but the principles it represented. And we'd emerged not just intact, but more committed than ever to the radical idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. The celebration was typically understated. No party or press conference, just a quiet evening after closing when our core group of supporters gathered to share coffee and reflect on what we'd learned. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd become both an advisor and a friend, raised her cup in a toast that captured everything we'd fought for. To revolutionary ordinary, she said, to the radical notion that different is just another way of being human. As summer arrived, bringing new challenges and opportunities, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that first morning when Jonathan sat alone at table 6. The scared, defensive man in the expensive suit had become a confident advocate, not just for disability rights, but for human dignity in all its forms. The invisible waitress had become a business owner whose voice carried weight in community discussions about inclusion and belonging. But perhaps most importantly, we'd proven that it was possible to build something valuable by choosing kindness over profit, community over hierarchy, love over fear. Our cafe had become more than a business. It was a daily demonstration that another way was possible, that success didn't have to come at the expense of others' worth. The lessons we'd learned extended far beyond the walls of Reed Donovan Cafe. Other businesses began adopting our practices, creating their own versions of revolutionary ordinary. Community organizations invited us to speak about inclusive hospitality. Urban planners consulted us about creating public spaces that welcomed everyone. But none of these broader impacts mattered as much as the daily miracle of watching strangers become neighbors, of seeing dignity recognized and celebrated in 1,000 small interactions. Every morning brought new proof that treating people as worthy of respect wasn't just morally right. It was good business, good community building, good for the soul. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday in September, exactly 4 years after our first meeting. I was reviewing inventory in the back office when Jonathan wheeled in, his face bright with excitement and something else I couldn't immediately identify. "Margaret," he said, "I just got off the phone with the mayor's office. They want to make Reed Donovan the flagship example of inclusive business practices. They're planning a citywide initiative based on our model." Recognition from the mayor's office was flattering, but Jonathan's expression suggested there was more to the story. "And there's something else," he continued. "My father called. He wants to meet with both of us. He's finally ready to admit that maybe my approach to business hasn't been the disaster he predicted." Harold Reed was a legend in Manhattan business circles, the son of immigrants who'd built a textile empire into a diversified investment portfolio worth over $1 billion. He'd spent 50 years proving that the only thing that mattered in business was profit, and he'd raised his son to follow the same ruthless path to success. The accident had complicated their relationship in ways that went beyond Jonathan's physical limitations. Harold couldn't understand how his brilliant, driven son had become what he saw as a bleeding heart idealist, more concerned with making customers feel good than maximizing revenue per square foot. "He's seen our financial reports," Jonathan explained. "After 4 years of telling everyone who'd listen that we'd be bankrupt within 6 months, he has to acknowledge that kindness can actually be profitable." The meeting was scheduled for the following week in the Reed Holdings conference room, the same space where I'd first signed our partnership agreement. But this time, I wasn't nervous about meeting with lawyers and business executives. I was curious about the man who'd raised Jonathan, who'd somehow produced a son capable of such extraordinary compassion, despite being taught that feelings were a luxury successful people couldn't afford. Harold Reed was smaller than I'd expected, a compact man in his 70s whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the slight stoop of someone who'd carried heavy burdens for too long. His eyes were the same green as Jonathan's, but where his son's held warmth and humor, Harold's carried the cold calculation of someone who'd learned to see everything in terms of profit and loss. "Ms. Donovan," he said, rising from his chair with the careful courtesy of old-school business etiquette. "I've heard a great deal about you." The conference table was covered with financial reports, marketing analysis, and what appeared to be architectural drawings. Harold gestured toward the documents with the pride of someone about to reveal a masterpiece. "Your little experiment has exceeded all reasonable expectations," he began, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a performance review. "4 years of steady growth, customer loyalty rates that exceed industry standards by 300%, profit margins that would be impressive for establishments charging twice your prices." He paused, studying my reaction to his assessment. I waited patiently, understanding that Harold Reed wasn't someone who got to his point quickly. "Which brings me to my proposal," he continued. "I want to franchise Reed Donovan. 50 locations within 5 years, each one a perfect replica of what you've created here. We could revolutionize the hospitality industry while generating returns that would make both of you wealthy beyond your current imagination." Wealthy beyond imagination. The phrase should have thrilled me, but instead I felt something cold settling in my stomach. I looked across the table at Jonathan, whose expression had gone carefully neutral in the way I'd learned to recognize as his shield against disappointment. "Every location would maintain your standards," Harold pressed on, apparently interpreting our silence as negotiating strategy rather than horror. "Same menu, same prices, same training protocols. We'd create a manual documenting every aspect of your inclusive hospitality model, ensure consistency across all markets." A manual. As if the heart of what we'd created could be reduced to a series of procedures and policies, as if the relationships we'd built could be replicated through corporate training programs. "The architectural plans would be standardized," Harold continued, spreading out drawings that showed generic cafe layouts with designated spaces for wheelchair accessibility. Each location would be designed for maximum efficiency while maintaining the aesthetic elements that contribute to customer comfort. I studied the drawings, seeing our warm chaos reduced to clean lines and standardized measurements. The round tables that invited conversation had become regulation rectangles. The comfortable mismatched chairs were now uniform seating units. The local artwork that celebrated our neighborhood's creativity had been replaced with corporate-approved prints. "The financial projections are extraordinary," Harold said, pulling out spreadsheets covered with numbers that represented everything I'd learned to distrust about business. "Conservative estimates suggest each location could generate annual profits of $2 to $3 million. With 50 locations, we're talking about building a $150 million business within 5 years. A $150 million business. The numbers were staggering, representing financial security not just for Jonathan and me, but for our children, their children. Generations of prosperity built on the foundation of what we'd created. But as I looked at those numbers, I thought about Mrs. Murphy counting out exact change while secretly managing millions, about the way her face lit up when she entered our space and knew she'd be welcomed without condition. Could that welcome survive corporate systematization? Could genuine care be franchised and distributed through training manuals? "What about local adaptation?" I asked, voicing the concern that seemed most immediate. "Different neighborhoods have different needs, different communities. How do we maintain authenticity while imposing uniformity?" Harold's smile was tolerant, the expression of someone explaining obvious truths to a well-meaning amateur. "Authenticity is largely a matter of perception, Ms. Donovan. With proper branding and consistent execution, customers will feel the same sense of welcome at any Reed Donovan location. That's the beauty of successful franchising, creating the illusion of uniqueness while maintaining operational efficiency." The illusion of uniqueness. as if what we'd built was theatrical rather than genuine, as if the relationships and community we'd fostered were just clever marketing tricks that could be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to come from a lifetime of having his values reduced to profit calculations. "Dad, I appreciate the financial opportunity, but you're missing the point of what we've created here." "The point," Harold replied with the patience of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding, "is to build sustainable prosperity. You've proven that kindness can be profitable. Now let's leverage that proof into generational wealth." Generational wealth. The phrase carried the weight of Harold's entire worldview. The belief that success was measured by the ability to accumulate resources that outlasted individual lives, that the ultimate goal of any enterprise was to create financial legacies that would endure long after their creators were gone. But what about the legacy of changed lives? What about the generational impact of treating people with dignity, of creating spaces where everyone belonged? Could those intangible benefits be measured in spreadsheets, franchised through corporate manuals, sustained through profit-driven expansion? "We need time to consider your proposal," I said, recognizing that this conversation was too important to be resolved in a single meeting. Harold nodded, apparently expecting negotiation rather than idealistic resistance. "Take all the time you need. The opportunity will remain available, but I'd encourage you to move quickly. The market for authentic hospitality experiences is becoming increasingly competitive." Authentic hospitality experiences. Even our refusal to treat people as commodities had become, in his mind, just another market segment to be captured and monetized. The weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations and sleepless nights. Jonathan and I found ourselves discussing not just the practical implications of Harold's proposal, but the fundamental question of what we'd been trying to accomplish with our lives. Could our values survive corporate expansion? Could the revolutionary ordinary we'd created in one small cafe be replicated across dozens of locations? More troubling, did we have the right to refuse financial security not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose livelihood depended on our success? David, our faithful barista who'd grown from uncertain college student to confident manager, offered a perspective that cut through our philosophical debates with practical wisdom. "The question isn't whether you should expand," he said during one of our after-closing discussions. "The question is whether the world needs more places like this one, and if it does, whether franchising is the best way to create them." Maria, our head chef who'd followed us from Tony's original cafe, was characteristically direct. "You cannot bottle love and sell it in stores. What we have here, it grows from knowing each other, from caring about our neighbors. How do you train someone to care? How do you franchise a heart?" Her words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. Our cafe succeeded not because we'd discovered some revolutionary business model, but because we'd committed ourselves to genuinely knowing and caring for our customers and each other. That commitment couldn't be systematized, franchised, or reduced to operational procedures, but the financial pressures were real and growing. Our lease was up for renewal, and the landlord had made it clear that our below-market rent would no longer be sustainable. Competition from chain stores with larger marketing budgets was affecting our customer base. Without significant capital investment, we might not survive another year. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd become not just a customer, but an informal advisor, proposed an alternative to Harold's franchise model. "What if you opened a school instead of franchises?" she suggested during one of our community meetings. "Train other people to create their own versions of inclusive hospitality, but let each place develop its own identity based on its own community." A school. The idea was both simpler and more complex than corporate expansion. Instead of replicating our exact model, we could teach the principles behind it, the philosophy of radical hospitality, the practices that created genuine inclusion, the business methods that made kindness profitable. We could work with aspiring restaurateurs who shared our values, help them understand their own communities, support them in creating spaces that honored the unique needs and characteristics of their neighborhoods while maintaining the core commitment to treating everyone with dignity. The Reed Donovan Institute for Inclusive Hospitality opened its doors to the first class of students on a warm spring morning, exactly 5 years after Jonathan and I had signed our original partnership agreement. The converted warehouse space in Brooklyn housed not just classrooms and a demonstration kitchen, but a working cafe where students could practice the principles they were learning while serving real customers with real needs. Our first cohort included a retired teacher from Detroit who wanted to create a breakfast place for students who couldn't afford school cafeteria food, a former corporate executive from San Francisco who'd left the financial sector to build community spaces in underserved neighborhoods, and a young mother from Atlanta whose food truck had evolved into a vision for sit-down restaurants that welcomed families regardless of their children's behavior or special needs. Teaching forced us to articulate what we'd been practicing intuitively. How do you read the difference between customers who want conversation and those who need solitude? When does helpful attention become intrusive surveillance? How do you balance business requirements with human dignity when the two seem to conflict? The answers weren't found in textbooks or corporate manuals, but in thousands of small interactions, careful observations, and constant recalibration based on feedback from the communities we served. Each student brought different challenges, different opportunities, different definitions of what inclusion meant in their specific contexts. Jonathan proved to be a natural teacher, combining his business acumen with hard-won insights about navigating the world as someone whose difference was immediately visible. His lectures on dignity-based customer service became legendary among hospitality professionals, seeking alternatives to corporate training programs that reduced human interactions to scripted exchanges. I discovered that my decades of invisible service had given me a unique perspective on what customers actually needed versus what they thought they wanted. The subtle art of anticipating needs without anticipating too much, of being available without being intrusive, of finding the balance between professional service and genuine care. But perhaps most importantly, we learned that our model could indeed be replicated, not through franchise operations, but through careful mentorship of people who shared our commitment to radical hospitality. Each cafe our graduates opened was unique, shaped by its owner's personality and its community's specific needs, but all were united by the fundamental belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. The success of our students exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 2 years, Reed Donovan Institute graduates had opened 23 establishments across 12 states, each one adapting our principles to their local context while maintaining the core commitment to inclusive service. Marcus Williams, our Detroit graduate, created Murphy's Breakfast House in a neighborhood where many children arrived at school hungry and remained hungry throughout the day. His pay-what-you-can pricing model and homework help program transformed breakfast service into community support, turning economic necessity into educational opportunity. Sarah Kim, the former San Francisco executive, opened Bridgepoint Cafe in a rapidly gentrifying Oakland neighborhood. Her carefully calibrated menu offered both affordable options for longtime residents and premium choices for newer arrivals, creating a space where economic integration happened naturally over shared meals. Jennifer Torres, the Atlanta mother, developed family-friendly service practices that welcomed parents dealing with tantrums, teenagers navigating social awkwardness, and grandparents struggling with mobility issues. Her restaurants became havens for families who'd been made to feel unwelcome elsewhere, proving that inclusion often meant simply refusing to judge others for being human. As our institute's reputation grew, we attracted attention from hospitality schools, restaurant associations, and business consultants seeking to understand how soft skills could generate hard profits. The requests for consulting, speaking engagements, and curriculum development created opportunities we'd never imagined. But success also brought its own challenges. The temptation to expand faster, to accept every speaking engagement and consulting contract, to transform our institute into the kind of corporate training company that reduced human dignity to measurable customer satisfaction scores. The balance became even more delicate when Harold Reed returned with a new proposal 6 months after our institute opened. The success of our graduates had proven that our model could be scaled, and he wanted to acquire the institute as part of Reed Holdings' expansion into the experiential hospitality sector. "You've created something remarkable," he acknowledged during our second conference room meeting, his tone carrying genuine respect this time. "A methodology that generates superior financial returns while creating positive social impact. The market opportunity is enormous." Market opportunity. Even our teaching had become, in his mind, a product to be packaged and sold. But this time, Jonathan and I didn't need weeks to consider our response. "Thank you, but no," I said. Our refusal delivered with the calm certainty that came from understanding exactly who we were and what we valued. The Reed Donovan Institute isn't for sale because what we're teaching can't be owned. Harold's expression shifted through surprise, disappointment, and finally a grudging respect that maybe, just maybe, his son had found something more valuable than the generational wealth he'd spent decades accumulating. The Institute continued to grow, but at a pace that preserved our commitment to individual attention and community connection. We took on new students only when we could properly support them, expanded to new programs only when they served genuine educational needs rather than market opportunities. Our original cafe remained the heart of everything we did, the place where theory met practice, where students could observe inclusive hospitality in action, where Jonathan and I returned each morning to remember why we'd started this journey. Mrs. Murphy, now in her late 80s, but still sharp as the financial instruments she'd once managed, held court at her regular table, while students observed how genuine care created customer loyalty that no marketing campaign could replicate. David, now co-manager of our Brooklyn operation, demonstrated how authentic relationships transformed service from task to calling. The years passed with the comfortable rhythm of meaningful work. New students arrived each semester, bringing fresh perspectives and challenges that kept us learning alongside them. Graduates returned with stories of success and failure, of communities transformed and obstacles overcome, of the daily miracles and ordinary struggles that defined life in the hospitality industry. Jonathan and I settled into the roles of teachers, mentors, and occasionally wisdom keepers for a growing network of people committed to treating everyone with dignity. Our partnership deepened from business alliance to genuine friendship, built on shared values and mutual respect. But perhaps most remarkably, we'd created something that neither of us could have imagined during those first difficult days at Tony's Cafe. Not just a successful business or even a thriving institute, but a movement of people committed to the radical notion that kindness wasn't weakness, that inclusion wasn't charity, that treating everyone with dignity wasn't just morally right, but practically effective. The impact rippled outward in ways we couldn't track or measure. A child who felt welcomed in one of our graduates' restaurants might grow up believing that belonging was their birthright. A person with disabilities who found dignity in an inclusive cafe might develop the confidence to advocate for change in other spaces. A server who learned to see customers as human beings rather than income sources might carry that perspective into every relationship. These immeasurable changes, the transformation of individual lives, the elevation of community standards, the quiet revolution of daily kindness, became our true legacy. More valuable than franchise profits or corporate expansion, more lasting than financial returns or business awards. As I approached my 70th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from invisibility to influence, from serving others to serving with others, from accepting the world as it was to helping create the world as it could be. The girl who'd stepped off a bus from Ohio 49 years earlier could never have imagined becoming a teacher, a business owner, or a voice for change in an industry built on hierarchies and exploitation. But every choice I'd made, to treat Jonathan with kindness when others showed cruelty, to defend his dignity when it would have been easier to stay silent, to choose principle over comfort when my livelihood was at stake, had led to this moment of profound satisfaction. Not satisfaction in the sense of completion, but in the knowledge that my life had mattered, that the work we'd done together had made a difference that would outlast any individual achievement or recognition. The Reed Donovan Institute would continue long after Jonathan and I were gone, training new generations of hospitality professionals in the revolutionary art of treating everyone with dignity. Our graduates would open new establishments, face new challenges, adapt our principles to changing times and communities. But the heart of what we'd created, the simple recognition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and welcomed, would remain constant. Because dignity isn't fashionable or trendy, it's fundamental to human flourishing. And businesses, communities, and individuals that honor that truth will always find ways to thrive. The morning light streamed through the windows of our original cafe as I sat at table 6, the same spot where Jonathan had once been mocked and dismissed. Students moved through their morning routines, serving customers with the careful attention we'd taught them, creating small moments of connection that would ripple outward in ways we might never know. In a few hours, I would teach a class on reading customer needs, sharing insights gained from 5 decades of watching people navigate public spaces with varying degrees of comfort and belonging. Jonathan would lead a session on dignity-based business practices, helping our students understand that profitability and principle weren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of sustainable success. This afternoon, we'd host a visit from city planners interested in applying our inclusive design principles to public spaces. Tonight, we'd review applications from potential students whose stories of struggle and determination reminded us why this work mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose kindness over convenience, community over profit, love over fear. And for as long as we were able, Jonathan and I would continue building something beautiful from the simple recognition that every person who walks through any door deserves to be treated with the dignity that makes us human. Have you ever found yourself serving others while feeling invisible yourself? Have you watched someone being treated cruelly because of their differences and wished you had the courage to speak up? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and sharing it might give someone else the strength they need to choose dignity over silence, courage over convenience. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it can reach another person who needs to be reminded of their own worth. Together, we can create more spaces where everyone belongs, where kindness isn't weakness, but the strongest foundation for building the world we want to live in. To continue this journey of discovering the extraordinary in the ordinary, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving as this one. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with me. I'll see you in our next story, where we'll explore again how ordinary people create extraordinary change through the simple choice to see each other's humanity.